And I've always been fascinated by how we can build real-world artificial intelligence. We have seen amazing advances in recent years. In digital intelligence, for example, AI that can understand digital content from the internet, such as images, videos, and social networks. AI that can understand physical intelligence. How can we build these robots that are able to perceive the physical world and interact with the physical world? Also social intelligence. How can AI interact with humans by perceiving human behaviors? And I stumbled upon this area called multimodal AI about 5 years ago, that became my PhD. And it's a really crucial area because all these different types of intelligence requires some form of multimodality. Understanding digital intelligence requires us to understand human written language, images, audios, and graphs on the internet. Understanding physical intelligence requires these AI agents to understand real-world physical sensors like videos, LiDARs, and high-frequency sensors. And in social intelligence, it requires AI to understand human speech, human gestures, and human language. So soon after, I was taking this class back at CMU with Manuel and Blum, and they were talking about their CTM model. And of course, there's a very natural connection between multimodality and human intelligence, right? All of us humans are able to use these different sensory modalities, perceive from the outside world to make decisions, right? We can see, we can hear, we can touch, we can smell, we can taste. And therefore, it's always been a grand goal of AI to build models that are able to take in similar sensory modalities, integrate them, and use that to perceive the outside world. So I'm going to start with a very simple motivating example. Some of you might have seen this. This really motivated, back in the 1970s and 80s, the behavioral study of multimodal machine learning. So I'm going to play 2 video clips. I want you to watch the video clip and also listen to what the speaker in the video clip is saying.
Ba, 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 ba.
So that's the first video clip. There's going to be a second one.
Ba, 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 ba.
So hopefully some of you noticed the similarities or the differences. The interesting thing is that if you're on your phone or your computer, which I know some of you are, both of those video clips would have seemed exactly the same to you. And the answer is that both video clips are actually exactly the same from the audio perspective. But if you look at the speaker while listening to the audio, you can tell that the first person is saying ba with a B, and the second speaker is saying fa with an F. So this was the McGurk effect, and this psychologist called David McNeil really studied this effect comprehensively and found that previously people were just recognizing speech from audio. But in fact, humans recognize speech from both audio and also what they see. And that very quickly started the first era of multimodal research, the behavioral era. He built models of human behavior, such as models for audio-visual speech recognition, and deploy them in the real world to improve our speech recognition systems. That slowly led to the computational era, turning these behavioral insights into computational models, like computational models of audio-visual speech recognition based on hidden Markov models, for example. We had computational models for a single speaker, a single person. Can we then put these two together? Can we get humans and computers to interact with each other through these multimodal systems? And finally, we all know what happened in the 2010s. We saw a huge boom in machine learning and deep learning research. And that came the deep learning era of multimodal research. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about 2 main things. I'm going to first start with my perspective of multimodal machine learning, especially the representation learning, deep learning perspective. It's very much based on recent surveys, tutorials we've been giving at conferences, and also courses we've been teaching at CMU with my professors. And then I'm going to talk about how can we use multimodal machine learning to help us in our study of consciousness. And we have some insights. We know that multimodal is definitely really important for certain human behaviors, but what is the exact relation between multimodal learning and consciousness? So the first part of the talk, some basic insights and basic review of multimodal machine learning. So modalities are different ways in which data in the natural world can be expressed or perceived. We can look at it as a spectrum, where a sensor starts recording data from the outside world, and these are raw modalities, directly from the sensor. You can then start processing these modalities through information extraction, through classification to get more abstract representations. So raw modalities can be speech signals that are recorded through the microphone. It can then be language extracted from speech. And we can slowly start processing this to get sentiment or other extracted behaviors from language. And multimodal, therefore, involves multiple modalities. But a more research-oriented definition is that multimodal is the science of 2 things: heterogeneous and interconnected data. And these are the 2 key words I want everyone to take away from this talk. Heterogeneous because all these modalities that we look at the information present in them is going to show different qualities, different structures, and different representations. And this, again, heterogeneity is a whole spectrum. We have homogeneous modalities with similar qualities to heterogeneous modalities with very different qualities. So on the homogeneous side, we might have images from two cameras. Right? They're almost the same. They might show different viewpoints. Different cameras might have different characteristics physically, but it's still roughly the same. We might have text from two different languages. They refer to the same thing that can be translated back and forth from each other, but they're still different because they have different aspects of the language they came from. We can look at language and vision. They might refer to the same thing, for example, a caption for an image, but one contains very different information from the other. And finally, we can go even more different, more heterogeneous modalities, which could be the subject of future work. And one small side note is that abstract modalities, those that have gone through more processing, are more likely to be homogeneous. If you have raw data, they're going to be very different. But the more processing you do, you're more likely to be able to bring them into a homogeneous space. So when you think of heterogeneity, it's useful to think of some dimensions, right? You have this running example, for example, this image and the corresponding caption. One dimension is what are the key elements that build up these modalities, right? Images of laptops, images of teacups, images of sofas. And on the text side, the reference to teacup in language, the word write, the word laptop, and the words clean and move. So differences in terms of the basic elements building up these modalities. You can look at the granularity. So this has always been a big focus of study. Are these modalities high frequency or low frequency? How many objects per image, or how many words per sentence are we looking at? You look at the total information contained in these modalities, the total entropy, for example, and how dense the elements are. You can look at the structure. Image is essentially a spatial structure. Your objects related spatially, left, right, top, down with respect to other objects. But language is a latent hierarchical structure because they're generated by a hierarchical grammar. Noise is another big one. When we process these modalities, we want to be robust to noise, like how humans are robust to noise. When we perceive modalities, right? We see an image, we expect to see camera blurs or motion blurs because of camera noise. When we see written language, we expect there to be certain typos, and we're able to correct these typos ourselves. So that's heterogeneity. The other key aspect is interconnections. Modalities are different, but they're not independent. We don't want to process these modalities separately. In other words, instead, these modalities are often related and share some complementary information that interact. And again, there's two levels. Just connections, the fact that these modalities are related and share some common information, and interactions, the fact that when we start merging these modalities for a prediction task, they're going to interact to give rise to new information in some way. So what are some examples of this? Again, going by these running examples, we know that the image of a teacup is connected to the word teacup. The image of the laptop is connected to the word laptop. And this seems trivial, right? But this is the first level of connections. The fact that statistically, these image regions and these words co-occur and correlate with each other. From a more semantic perspective, if we have knowledge, we know that that's because they refer to the same underlying object. That's called correspondence. What's the next level? Well, we look at a teacup and we can infer that it's clean. We look at the sofa and we can infer that it's in a room. Right? Again, links between image and language, but not exactly at the first level. From a statistical perspective, we know that that's because one element, one modality depends on the other. Right? We can take one and infer the other through causal inference. Or we can take one and know that one might come afterwards in time. These are temporal or causal dependencies. This goes one level beyond association, right? Because we need some knowledge. We can't just infer this from data. We need knowledge about what these elements are and how they interact with each other. From a semantic perspective, these are relationships, right? Basically, two elements being connected with some attribute. For example, a temporal attribute. One element happening after the other. So these are connections. And again, a whole big perspective of how we can learn these connections from data. The second aspect is that of interactions. Once we start taking in these modalities and trying to make a prediction, they're going to join. They're going to work with each other to learn new representations. What's an example of that? So again, same two running examples. I'm going to ask you a question. Is this indoors? And I'm going to look at my image, and most likely I'm going to infer that it's indoors. I'm going to look at the text, and that's also likely going to be indoors. So what we have here is an example of a redundant interaction. Both modality elements giving rise to the same inference, but both together enhance each other. Right? You're still going to use one to increase your confidence in what the other predicted. So you're most likely going to say yes with higher confidence. We can ask another question. Is this a living room? We look at the image and say yes, we see sofas in living rooms. I'm going to look at the language and probably say no. We see teacups, we see laptops. It's probably a study room. So that's an example of a non-redundant interaction. The fact that both modalities give different inferences, but one is going to dominate the other. And finally, something more complex. Should I work here? From the image, I might say maybe. It looks pretty good. There's a comfortable sofa, but the table's a bit too small. From the language, I say maybe too. There's clean room and there's tea. So again, both give different types of information, but together new information emerges. There can be very highly nonlinear interactions where you take both modalities in. And it's also going to depend on a person, on the setting. Do you want tea? Are you thirsty? Do you want a big table or a small table? So again, these are all examples of how modalities can interact in both human processing and how in digital processing, building multimodal machine learning models. And that just scratched the surface. If you look at this very nice paper back in 1999, this paper doesn't contain any AI, any multimodal machine learning at all, but rather looking at communication in animals. Right? How can animals use different multimodal behaviors to signify their intentions? And again, we see many cases of redundant information, redundant signals enhancing or being equivalent to each other to non-redundant signals that are independent or when new information can emerge from these signals. And again, that was just one dimension. That was looking at the response. We can also look at what input modalities interact. We can look at how these modalities interact for canastity, like whether it's additive or multiplicative or causal and logical and so on, and what's the exact context under which they interact. So that's the first key takeaway from this talk. That multimodal is a science of heterogeneous and interconnected data. And the very next key takeaway I want you to get is several key challenges in multimodal machine learning. We're going to look at these challenges very briefly, and I'm going to relate these challenges to what's important in studying human consciousness. Because many things in human consciousness can be solved using these challenges. So in multimodal machine learning, we take these modalities in, develop some model, the output's either some representation or some label that you want to predict. And what are some key challenges within designing this model? And one of these core multimodal challenges that are relatively understudied in unimodal machine learning. So there's 6 big challenges. I'm going to go through these very quickly. The first challenge is that of representation. Can we look at all modalities, just focus on 2 elements, one from each modality, and how can we learn representations from them that summarize the fact that they're different through heterogeneity, and summarize the fact that they're related through these connections. And there's 3 big ways of doing this. You can fuse the modalities. You can bring 2 modalities into one representation that's useful for prediction. You can do coordination. You can keep 2 modalities and they're 2 separate representations, but coordinating them through some function. And you can do fission. You can take 2 modalities and try to learn more representations than you started with. Perhaps one representation is useful for representing the common information, and other representations are useful for modeling the unique information to each modality. The second big challenge is alignment. Can I take all of these elements, all these modalities, and learn how they're related to each other? And the first big sub-challenge is just explicitly capturing these connections. Which word is related to which part of the image, and which other words are related to which other parts of the image. That's connections. We can learn contextualized representations, taking advantage of these connections to learn better representations. Can I learn better representations of sentences given the surrounding videos or images they co-occur with? And finally, segmentation. Certain modalities are continuous. They're based on high-frequency signals. Can I segment and discretize them so that I can start learning these connections? The third challenge is reasoning. Can I take what I've learned in terms of alignment across different modality elements and the representation between them and learn a multi-step inferential structure in order to best capture my prediction task? And usually when you hear multi-step, you'll use multiple layers of neural networks. But most of the challenge in reasoning is to be more explicit. Can we combine the information that we've learned in a systematic and principled way that is both more robust and also interpretable by humans? And when we look at interpretability, perhaps some of the intermediate representations can be attention maps, or it can be language. Right? We can visualize language at each step of our processing, then we can perfectly understand what's going on. And typically this doesn't come for free. It requires some form of external knowledge to inform how you're going to do this reasoning process. So some sub-challenges here involve learning the structure that we're composing our data, what intermediate concepts to use, whether it's deep neural network representations, attention maps, or language, how we infer more complicated representations from more basic ones, and what type of external knowledge should we use. Generation, instead of making a prediction, looks at how can we produce more data from more modalities. Right? Summarization looks at taking higher dimensional data, summarizing it. Translation looks at taking one modality, converting it to the equivalent form in the other. And creation looks at taking very small gists and creating more data than you started with that has some consistency and coherence to it. Again, these are categorized based on whether you're reducing, maintaining, or expanding information content. Transference looks at using more high-resource modalities to help you infer low-resource modalities. Can we take it some modality with not that much data, but use other modalities to help it? And certain challenges here involve transferring information from one modality to the other. Co-learning, where one modality is used as extra input or extra output to help you make a prediction. And model induction, where you're keeping separate models, but they're sharing information with each other, such as co-training. And finally, quantification. Can we revisit all of these previous technical challenges and better understand the two key challenges? Heterogeneity, how data is different from each other, and interactions, how data is similar and related to each other in the context of the learning process. So these 6 challenges typically occur one after the other. All of these multimodal problems in both humans and AI, we're always starting by learning representations of these local elements. And then we're going to look at, beyond these 2 elements, all elements in their context. How can we align data across different elements? Combining this information involves reasoning, ideally in a principled and hierarchical manner, to make a prediction. And sometimes we don't care about making a prediction. We want to generate more data, or we might want to transfer information from one modality to the other. And finally, we're going to revisit these 5 concepts in terms of quantification. We actually understand how our models are working and why they work in such a manner. So now I'm going to look at representation coordination as one case study. I'm going to look at this example, and I'm going to relate it to how we can study Brainish, this multimodal language in a CTM. So going a bit more detail on coordinated representations, what you're going to learn here is they're going to take in both elements and modalities, use encoders that can be specialized, and that's where you kind of capture heterogeneity in your data. You use different encoders to capture different structures or different noise in different modalities. And that gives you some representations. And in coordination, I'm basically going to define a similarity function, a coordination function, that captures the fact that certain modality pairs are related in some way, and certain modality pairs should not be related in some other way. So learning then involves learning the coordination function that takes in the representations that have been encoded by both encoders into representation space. And what are some examples of these coordination functions? You can use cosine similarity to represent the fact that they align as vectors in representation space. You can use kernel similarity, which extends linear kernels to polynomial exponential kernels, or you can use correlation based, and the dimensions of representations are correlated with each other. And a very general way of learning these coordinated functions is that if you have some paired data, for example, modalities that you see co-occurring with each other, like images and text, here's some images, see corresponding text, blue car, yellow bus, airplane, bowl of cats. We're going to define positive pairs, the fact that they correspond to each other. And anything other than these positive pairs are negative pairs. And your objective function to learn these models will then involve contrastive learning. Bringing these positive pairs and the representations close together, and pushing apart the representations of your negative pairs. Essentially, maximizing your coordination function for positive pairs and minimizing your coordination function for these negative pairs. And the coordination function can be something simple like cosine similarity. And when you start learning these functions, you can learn very cool embeddings of your visual data and your language semantic data. You can go into this space, you can take this blue car, embed it into representation. You can subtract the embedding for blue, you can add the embedding for red, and for the resulting embedding, you can retrieve the nearest images, and you can see all these red cars. You can do the same for subtracting blue, adding yellow, you can see the nearest retrieved images of all these yellow cars. You can also take your pictures of your airplane, subtract the embedding for flying, add the embedding for sailing, and retrieve nearest images of sailboats. And you can take the bowl of cats, subtract the embedding for bowl, and add a box, and you can see all these cute images of cats and boxes. And recently, we've seen people do this at a much larger scale. Instead of just retrieving nearest images in this coordinated space, but actually generating these images pixel by pixel. Right? Can I take it, a sentence that can be super weird, astronaut riding a horse in the style of Andy Warhol, you put it into a model, and it actually generates these very realistic images in the style that you want it to be. You can take a caption, a bowl of soup that is a portal to a new dimension as digital art, and you can generate these images pixel by pixel. This is all the basis of coordinating, taking positive images and their captions, coordinating them together, and using that to generate new images. So that's our key idea, right? A lot of Brainish, a lot of users in CTM can be summarized as this key idea. Taking in different modality elements, embedding them using specialized encoders that respect heterogeneity, that respects the uniqueness of each modality, and learning a coordinated representation space that captures the connections between positive pairs and negative pairs. Of course, with the assumption that you know what the positive pairs are and what the negative pairs are. So to see how this can be used in a CTM, we're going to look at 3 simple case studies, 3 key studies which are very important with human consciousness. The first one is that a model of the world. So this is a processor that takes in all of these different sensory inputs of the world, such as language, what I see, what I hear, what I touch, what I smell. Learn a common representation and use that to predict what actions and what these actions are going to be influenced, what the influences of these actions on the world. So this model of the world processors should combine the multisensory information, should plan actions, and also predict the effects of these actions on the world. And again, we've seen this. This is basically representation fusion, right? Taking in more modalities that you have and fusing them into one representation which you can use to predict your actions and their consequences. So some examples of this are taking in, for example, what I see through language, vision, audio, when I look at someone speaking and predicting their behaviors. Looking at what I see and what I feel and trying to predict how I should manipulate my hands, or robotics, how I should predict the actions of these robots. And essentially how this framework comes into play is that you're going to take all these modalities that you want to fuse into your coordinated representation space and combine them. They're in the same space, you can add them, you can concatenate them, they represent the same semantic meaning, and learn a decoder that performs fusion, that predicts your outputs. Another example is that of inner speech. Right? I can look at something, like a picture of a dog, and I can imagine other pictures of dogs. I can imagine this dog. That's a translation problem, taking in one modality and predicting other modalities. I can imagine speech. Right? That's a cute dog I want to pet. I can look at inner audio, what the dog sounds like, and what it feels like. Again, in this framework, that's taking in one modality, going through the elements, and retrieving the nearest one. Right? That's a translation problem, retrieving the nearest element in representation space. And finally, dreams. Dreams is a creation problem. If I've seen something in a day, like images of dogs, I can slowly start to imagine, I can start dreaming about these dogs, right? What they would look like, what words you use to describe them, and what they sound like. This is a creation problem, right? I'm going to take in small data, ingest, and try to generate more data. And again, this framework is helpful. Taking in one modality, go into representation space, and you can start searching semantically for nearby elements in that modality and in other modalities. Right? So that's the main gist of creation. So to summarize, we looked at 3 key things. As a basic introduction, multimodal is always a science of heterogeneity and interconnections in our data. We looked at several key challenges of representing, aligning, reasoning, generating more data, or transferring information across modalities. And finally, one key aspect is actually quantifying what these models are learning. And finally, we've looked at, in the context of intelligence and consciousness, multimodal is a key building block. And one way of doing it is a very general way. You start by defining these specialized encoders that represent heterogeneity. You can learn coordination functions that capture the connections between your modalities. You can then define decoders, whether you want a decoder for fusion or translation or creation. They're all applicable in this framework. And of course, it would have been possible without my collaborators, Manuel Lenore, and also other AI researchers at CMU. Thank you, everyone.